Welcome back to the Godly Impact Podcast. We are continuing our series, It's All in Your Head, the stories that we tell ourselves. And if you're new and this is your first time and you're just jumping in, welcome aboard. Love to have you. I do encourage you to go back when you get a chance and listen to the previous couple of episodes in this series because we're building up to things and everything that we are building on really does make a difference. The reason I'm doing this series is because this is one of the things that is truly the most transformative practices that can happen in a person's life. All of us tell ourselves stories. We tell ourselves dozens, hundreds of stories every single day. And the reason this is so important is that our stories become our beliefs become our actions become our nature, and our nature becomes our impact. And I want you to have a godly impact. And so as we have been in this series over the last couple of episodes, we've been looking specifically at the stories we tell ourselves, especially those micro stories, and also how defensive are we or how open are we when somebody challenges our stories. Yeah, so those micro stories, they're the ones we tell ourselves about the person who cuts us off in traffic, the scatterbrained clerk at the store, the rude cashier at the drive-thru, the neighbor's kid, the neighbor's dog, whatever. And the accumulation of these stories both reveals and shapes our character, our nature. It reveals and shapes our mindset and also the expectations that we have of ourselves and of others. And so today what we're going to be looking at is we're going to begin expanding this practice that I've encouraged you to do over the last couple of weeks, to being intentional, to just get curious about the stories that you're telling yourselves. Pay attention to those. Maybe record those in a journal or keep some index cards with you and in your car or wherever you are at work, and just kind of jot down the summary of the stories that you're telling yourselves. And then as you become curious about those, don't be like, oh, this is a little, scary. I mean, this is kind of revealing some things about myself I didn't know and I'm not sure that I like. Don't let shame force those stories back into hiding, because again, you can't change what you don't name, and you're not going to name something if you don't bring it into the light. And so today I want us to focus on that we expand this practice, this habit, beyond our micro stories to what I'm going to call are the macro stories. Now, macro stories always begin with a micro story. And macro stories tend to come in two flavors. They're either the up close and personal stories that we tell again about people that we're up close and personal with. Or we also tell ourselves macro stories about people that are far away and impersonal. Now, impersonal doesn't mean that we don't care. It doesn't mean that we're so removed and detached it has no impact. Paradoxically, we can be more attached to our impersonal stories than our personal ones. Because when we're telling ourselves a story about a person or a group of people that are far away from us, it's harder for those stories to be challenged. Because why? Well, they're far away from us. So what do I mean with a far away and impersonal story? Well, we're going to get to that in just a minute. But first, I just want to invite you, if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast and share this with a couple of friends. This is truly transformational information for everyone, because this isn't like, well, this is only for some people, but not for, no. Everybody tells themselves stories all the time. It's just part of who we are as human beings. If you're breathing, you're telling yourself a story. And so being able to be intentional about how we handle this characteristic in our life is part of being a life of maturity, and it's part of developing a life where we can have godly impact. And so share this with a couple of other people, invite them to subscribe, and then strike up conversations about this. Ask them, hey, that podcast episode, what do you think about that? Is that something that you've been doing? What have you been learning about the stories that you've been, telling yourself? And use this as a conversation for things that, I don't know, actually matter, actually help people in life. And, okay, if you're used to just sending cat memes back and forth, okay, I'm not saying you have to give up the cat memes, but I am saying maybe we can go with something that's a little bit more significant than that. So let's go back for a second. So what do I mean with a far away and impersonal story? Well, let's pick an easy one. Okay, I'm just going to pick this one because we can all relate to this, and it's an easy example. It's not the only example, but it's an easy one, and that is politics. Yep. People tell themselves all kinds of stories about politicians, both the ones they love and the ones they dislike, maybe even hate. They tell themselves stories about political parties, and anyone who belongs to that political party is automatically assigned kind of the same story. And it's astounding how convinced we can become about people's character, their motives, their values, and the priorities when we've never even been within handshaking distance of them. Now, I'm not suggesting that it's wrong to draw conclusions about anyone or any group unless we personally met them and shared a meal together. Okay, I mean, that's impractical. I'm not suggesting that. But there is a difference between truly educating yourself about a person's motives, their character, their values, their priorities, and living in an echo chamber where people just keep repeating the same claims over and over and over again. Years ago when my kids were growing up, they were involved in speech and debate. And so I have sat and judged a lot of debate tournaments in my time. And one of the things that I saw happen over and over again was students would get up and they had worked so incredibly hard in preparation for this debate tournament. And these weren't just, at the local level. These were national tournaments where I saw this happen. So kids that had a lot of experience, yet so it was so easy for them to fall back into this habit. And what was it? It was to confuse claims with evidence. And they might repeat the same claim over and over again. But it doesn't matter if you say something 3,265 times. That doesn't make it true. Because it's not how the frequency or the volume or the intensity or the emotion behind something that makes it true. They're just claims. This is why we have laws. This is why we have trials. And we have laws about how trials are run. Somebody can't just get up there and make a bunch of claims. It's like, but where's the evidence? We have to make decisions based on the evidence, not just what somebody claims. But as individuals, we can regularly put people or entire groups of people kind of on trial, and we reach conclusions about them based on nothing more than repeated statements and persuasive rhetoric. So we need to pay attention to the stories that we're telling ourselves about others. And that it's not just about improving personal relationships. Yes, this is incredibly important for us to practice in our life so that we do grow our personal relationships. But it's far more than that. It's about developing a way of thinking, a lens through which we view all of life. We don't need more people just jumping onto any bandwagon, whether it's in person or it's on social media, who are more committed to protecting their stories than to discovering the truth. We need people who will be committed to the practice of discovering the truth, not just protecting their stories. And again, we talked last time about confirmation bias and ownership bias. And boy, is that at work today in our culture. All throughout human history, untrue but emotionally charged stories preceded and fueled every practice of oppression. I have taught history, So I'm not an expert on all things historical, but I do know enough to know that if you go back through history, throughout time, on all the different continents, whenever you saw oppression occurring, there was an embedded story that justified that to the oppressors every single time. When we were in the midst of the slave trade, then slave traders and owners repeated the story that slaves were incapable of the same emotions and intellectual achievements as they were. Here in the United States, the slave trade was dominantly from Africans. Also, there were slaves that came from other parts of South and Central America, but dominantly the slaves that came from Africa. And so how that was justified by slave traders and owners was just to say, well, they just don't have the same capacities. They don't have the same desires. They don't have the same skills. They don't have the same abilities as whites do. And we look at that today and think, how could anybody have actually truly believed that? But they did. I mean, they really thought that represented what was true. And we have to say, if we are intellectually honest people, and if we're going to be people of godly impact, we have to be committed to that. What are we believing today in our culture that in the future people will look back and go, how in the world could they possibly have believed that was true? And when we look back even at feudal systems, when you had landed nobility, they repeated basically the same story, that peasants didn't have the same desires or capacities as or hopes as the ruling class. And it wasn't even that long ago that women in the United States couldn't vote because the story was they were way too emotional. They couldn't think rationally enough to be able to make good decisions about who should be in office. And we still have some vestiges of that kind of thinking. Oh, women are way too emotional, and that's why they shouldn't be in these positions or shouldn't be in that positions. And sometimes the people who repeat that the most are women. And so what happens? We're telling ourselves a story about an entire group of people, about an entire gender. I don't know how many times I've heard the statement, for example, about men that, well, men are such babies whenever they're sick. And we just repeat that as if we claim that as if it's true. We don't even have to support it. We don't need evidence. Or if we do, we just kind of look at our husband or our kid or whatever. And all of a sudden that becomes true for an entire gender. Well, it's not something that's biologically true whatsoever. So we need to stop repeating things like that because these stories have real impact. Behind every single type of classism, racism, sexism are a group of people who have committed themselves to a story, a narrative that justifies putting others in their place, or worse, eliminating them altogether. Now you might be saying, okay, well, that's all interesting stuff, but I don't see any connection, to my life. I'm not a racist, for example. And so what's the big deal about this whole what's my story thing? Well, there's a saying that says you don't rise to a challenge, you fall to your level of training. And oftentimes this is attributed to the military, which they can definitely use, but it actually goes back to an ancient Greek poet and soldier, and who expressed this, first of all. See, when we have trained our mind to accept personal stories with little time or effort invested in challenging these stories, we won't be able to recognize or challenge narratives that deal with groups of people. If I'm not in the habit of challenging the story that I tell about my spouse or my kids or my neighbor or friend or family member, people who are up close and personal, I am far less likely to challenge myself about what's the story I'm telling myself about a person or a people group who are far away and removed. And when we don't practice that as a habit in ourselves and in our culture, eventually oppression always results. It's not a matter of if, it's just going to be a matter of who and how bad and how long. And this is one of the reasons that it's so important that we learn to pay attention to our stories and then to not become defensive about them, but to recognize we have the responsibility to become not just curious about those, but to start challenging the stories ourselves, as well as being open to other people poking at those stories as well. Because again, our stories become our beliefs. Our beliefs become our actions become our nature, and our nature becomes our impact. And you have an immeasurable, eternal, and irreplaceable impact. It's not a matter of if, but what kind. And I want you to make it a godly impact. One of the things that we can do is we tell ourselves stories about adolescents. You know, those creatures somewhere between the ages of 12 and 24. Maybe you have children in this category, grandchildren, students, kids in the youth group or your neighborhood or the gym where you work out or, the restaurant where you eat. Well, make sure the story that you are telling yourself about the adolescents in your life align with reality. It's based on truth. And one of the ways that you can do that is you can get a copy of my book, The Great Brain Remodel of Adolescence, How Contractors and Alligators Empower Understanding, ages 12 through 24. You're going to be amazed, and more importantly, you're going to be empowered with the research-backed science and the common sense solutions. So you can find links on my website, stephaniepresents.com, or you can find it on Amazon by searching for The Great Brain Remodel of Adolescence by yours truly, Stephanie Smith. All right, we're going to continue this series next time. In the meantime, keep looking at the stories that you are telling yourself, my friend, because it truly makes a difference in what kind of impact that you're having and you're going to have in the future. I'll see you next time.